November 1950, North Korea. 36 degrees below zero, and the blood froze in the tubes before it reached the wounded. Up on the ridgelines above a frozen reservoir, Marines were lying in holes they had chipped out of ground as hard as concrete. 2 men to a hole, one awake, one trying to sleep with his boots on, because a man who took his boots off in that valley did not get them back on. Sometime after 10 o'clock, the sentries heard something out in the dark that belonged to no weather report. Whistles. Then bugles. Then, from 3 sides at once, the sound of snow being crushed by thousands of feet. They had been told the war was almost over. Intelligence had told them the Chinese were not coming. What was walking toward their holes in the dark was the 9th Army Group of the People's Volunteer Army, 120,000 men, who had crossed into Korea at night, without vehicles, without radios, without fires, and had been lying in the snow for days waiting for exactly this moment. 30,000 United Nations troops were now surrounded, 78 miles from the sea, in the worst winter Korea had recorded in a century. What happened in the 17 days that followed is still taught at Quantico, not as a victory, and not as a defeat, but as the answer to a question every army eventually has to ask: what does a unit do when it is cut off, frozen, outnumbered 4-1, and ordered to save itself? 6 weeks earlier, none of this seemed possible. General MacArthur's landing at Incheon had broken the North Korean army, United Nations forces were racing north toward the Chinese border, and the talk at headquarters was of having the boys home by Christmas. The 1st Marine Division was ordered up a single mountain road toward the Chosin Reservoir, a road that in most places was 1 truck wide, with a cliff on one side and a drop on the other. The commander of that division did not believe a word of it. Major General Oliver P. Smith had spent his career reading terrain, and everything about this one frightened him: a single supply road, mountains that swallowed radio signals, and a Chinese border 100 miles away with an army behind it. He had already told a superior, in writing, that he considered the plan reckless. So Smith slowed his division down. He advanced at a pace his corps commander found close to insubordinate, stockpiled supplies at every stop, and, the decision that would save thousands of lives, ordered engineers to scrape an airstrip out of the frozen dirt at a village called Hagaruri, in the middle of nowhere, for an evacuation nobody had authorized and nobody yet believed would be needed. Look at the ground. The reservoir sits 4,000 feet up in the Taibik Mountains. One road runs south from it, Udamanai, then Hagaruri, then Kotori, then a mountain pass called Funchalen, and finally the port of Hungnam on the sea. 78 miles. Every mile of it overlooked by high ground, and by late November, every piece of that high ground had Chinese soldiers on it. And then there was the cold, which is not background in this story, it is a combatant. A Siberian front dropped temperatures to 36 below at night. Rifle actions froze. Mortar rounds fell short because the propellant burned wrong. Morphine had to be thawed in a corpsman's mouth before it would push. Plasma froze solid. Rations froze so hard that men chipped at frozen beans with bayonets and sucked the pieces. Every ordinary act of soldiering became slow, and slow gets men killed. The Chinese plan was simple and, on paper, decisive: cut the road in several places at once, split the division into pockets too far apart to help each other, and destroy them one at a time. On the night of the 27th they did exactly that. Udamanai was surrounded. Hagaruri was surrounded. Kotori was surrounded. The passes between them were cut. By dawn the 1st Marine Division existed as 3 separate islands in a sea of enemy infantry. Listen to how they attacked, because it terrified men who had already fought the Japanese. The Chinese had no radios below regimental level, so they maneuvered by sound: bugles, whistles, cymbals, shepherd's horns, each call meaning a different order. To a Marine in a hole at 2 in the morning, it sounded like the hillside itself was signaling to the hillside behind it. Then the flares went up green, and the first wave came in at a run. At Utameni the fighting went hand to hand in the dark, at ranges of a few feet, in snow deep enough to swallow a wounded man. Positions were overrun and taken back 3 times in a night. Machine gunners fired until their barrels glowed and the snow around them melted to mud, then froze again. When it got light, the Marines counted the dead in front of their holes in the hundreds, and knew the next night would be the same. And between the attacks, there was simply the cold, which never stopped working. Men slept in pairs for the body heat and woke with their eyelashes frozen shut. Sweat inside a boot became ice against the skin, which is why frostbite took so many feet from men who never stopped moving. Canteens froze and burst. Field dressings froze into boards. A wounded man left on the ground for 20 minutes was often beyond saving, not from the wound, but from the temperature. At Hagaruri, the village with the half-built airstrip, the perimeter was held by a garrison too small for the ground it covered, so the line was filled out with cooks, clerks, truck drivers and engineers, given rifles and told which direction to face. On the night of the 28th, the Chinese came over a piece of high ground called East Hill and nearly took the village. If Hagaruri had fallen, the airstrip would have fallen with it, and everything that followed, the 4,000 wounded flown out, the road south, the division itself, would have been impossible. What kept them alive in the meantime came out of the sky. Transport aircraft flew supply drops in mountain weather that grounded everything else, ammunition, rations, batteries, blood plasma, and, on request, dry socks by the thousand, because in that valley a dry pair of socks was a medical supply. Parachutes hung in the trees around every perimeter for the rest of the battle, like laundry nobody had time to take down. But the Chinese had paid a terrible price to get into position. To stay hidden they had marched at night and lain still through the days, in cotton uniforms and canvas shoes, without fires. Thousands were frostbitten before a shot was fired. Whole companies were later found in their firing positions, weapons pointed downhill, frozen where they lay. This photograph shows Chinese prisoners in the padded cotton uniforms that were never meant for a Korean winter above 4,000 feet. The hinge of the whole battle was a hill nobody had heard of. Toktong Pass carried the road between Utameni and Hagaruri. If it fell, the northern regiments were finished. Holding it was one reinforced rifle company, Fox Company, 7th Marines, 240 men, under a captain named William Barber, who had been in command for 6 weeks. Barber's company was attacked the first night and never stopped being attacked. They held for 5 days and 5 nights, resupplied by air, dug into snow with their own dead stacked as a windbreak. Barber was shot through the hip on the second night and had himself carried between the fighting positions on a stretcher so he could keep commanding. Of 240 men, 82 walked off that hill. They had held the pass, and the road behind it, open. Meanwhile, on the eastern side of the reservoir, the same night produced the battle's tragedy. An Army regimental combat team, about 2,500 men, remembered now as Task Force Faith, was hit by the same offensive without the Marines' consolidated perimeter. They fought for 4 days, lost their commander, and finally broke out across the ice. Of 2,500, about 1,000 reached safety, barely 400 were still fit to fight. It is the part of Chosin that is least told, and hardest to read. On the 4th day, Smith gave the order that defined the battle. He would not scatter, he would not abandon equipment, and he would not leave a single wounded man behind. The division would come out as a division, fighting south down that one road, opening it as it went, carrying its casualties and its dead. When a reporter asked whether the Marines were retreating, Smith gave the sentence that went around the world: "Retreat, hell, we are not retreating, we are just advancing in a different direction." Understand what that actually meant. The regiments at Utamenai had to fight 14 miles downhill through Chinese-held passes, carrying 600 wounded, in a column that moved at the speed of the men on foot. Where a hill blocked the road, they took the hill. Where a roadblock stopped the trucks, the infantry cleared it and the trucks moved again. It took 3 days to cover 14 miles, and they came into Hagaruri in formation, with their weapons, singing. Overhead flew the other reason any of them survived. Marine and Navy pilots worked so close to the ground that the men on the road could read the numbers on the wings, corsairs dropping napalm on ridges 200 yards from friendly lines, hour after hour, in weather that should have grounded everything. For 17 days the air wing was the division's artillery, its supply line, and its ambulance service. And the airstrip Smith had ordered built on a hunch became the most important patch of ground in Korea. Transport aircraft came into Hagaruri under fire, onto a runway barely half the regulation length, at 4,000 feet, in freezing fog. They flew out more than 4,000 wounded men, and flew in replacements, ammunition, and on one flight, a load of fresh bread. Every one of those 4,000 men would otherwise have had to be carried 70 miles. Which left one last problem, and it was the kind that ends campaigns. Below Kotori the road crossed a gorge at Funchalen Pass on a single concrete bridge over the outlet of a power station. There was no way around it, a cliff above, a 1,500-foot drop below. On December 4th, the Chinese blew that bridge into the gorge. The entire division, with its vehicles, its guns and its wounded, was now sealed on the mountain. What happened next has almost no precedent. The Air Force was asked whether it could drop a bridge. 8 C-119 transports flew from Japan carrying sections of portable steel treadway, each weighing 2,900 pounds, rigged under enormous parachutes. They dropped them onto a snowfield held by Marines under fire. One section was lost and one was damaged, the rest, plus a spare, were dragged into place by engineers working in the open at temperatures far below zero. On December 9th, the bridge went in. Then the whole division walked across it. Trucks, tanks, artillery, thousands of men, and a column of Korean civilians who had attached themselves to the Marines and refused to be separated from them. The last vehicles crossed under fire, and the engineers blew the bridge behind them for the second time in a week. This time on purpose. Count what it cost. On the United Nations side, more than 1,000 dead, nearly 5,000 missing, 4,500 wounded, and over 7,000 non-battle casualties, which is the official phrase for frostbite. Men lost fingers, toes, feet. Some who walked out of those mountains on their own legs never walked normally again. The 1st Marine Division came out of the reservoir with roughly half its rifle strength. On the Chinese side the arithmetic is worse, and most of it is written in ice. Their own figures admit some 21,000 battle casualties and more than 30,000 non-battle casualties, other estimates run far higher. 3 of the 12 divisions committed at Chosin were so wrecked by cold and combat that they were never rebuilt as fighting formations. The 9th Army Group, sent to destroy the 1st Marine Division, was out of the war for months. At Hungnam, the survivors reached the sea and found the largest sea lift the United States had mounted since D-Day, 193 ships, taking out 100,000 troops, and, because the Navy could not bring itself to leave them, roughly 100,000 Korean civilians who had walked to the port ahead of the advancing army. One freighter, the Meredith Victory, built to carry 12 passengers, took 14,000 refugees out on her decks. 5 children were born on the voyage. Not one person was lost. On Christmas Eve, with the last men aboard, the engineers destroyed the port behind them. This photograph, taken from a ship offshore, is the moment the harbor went up. Everything the army could not carry went with it, so that nothing useful would be left behind. Then the ships turned south, and the Chosin campaign was over. The men who came out of it called themselves the Chosin Few, and for a long time that was the only name the battle had in America, a footnote to a war that was being called forgotten before it was even finished. There is no film of most of it, because the cameras froze. What exists is a handful of photographs, a stack of after-action reports, and the memories of men who spent the rest of their lives unable to feel their feet properly. 17 medals of honor and dozens of Navy crosses came out of those 17 days, the highest concentration of the award in any single Marine Corps operation. Barber received his and stayed in the Corps until 1970. Smith, whose caution had been read as something close to insubordination, was quietly proved right by every serious study of the campaign that followed. And the mountains never gave everyone back. More than 1,000 Americans were listed missing at Chosin, most of them from the eastern side of the reservoir. In recent years, boxes of remains recovered from North Korea have been identified one man at a time by DNA, soldiers of Task Force Faith going home 70 years late, to families who had long stopped expecting anything. Those identifications are still being made today. So here is what Chosin leaves behind. There was no victory at that reservoir, the ground was lost, the advance was finished, and the war would grind on for 2.5 more years. What was saved was a division, and an idea, that a unit can be surrounded, frozen, and outnumbered 4-1, and still refuse to become a mob. They came out with their wounded, their weapons, and their dead. So ask yourself honestly, at 36 below, on the 4th day, would you have carried the man next to you? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe. Every battle comes down to one moment. The last salvo.